Yes, true. I did host a dog breed reveal party. We had a rescue, and so we were really interested in what breed she was. I was a little jealous that all my Facebook friends were doing gender reveals, and so I stole it for my dog. So before I get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about me. So as you know from the intro and my shirt, I work at Search Discovery, but before my time there, I built and led the digital analytics and optimization teams at UBS, the investment bank, and the American Medical Association. So if any of you are looking for someone to commiserate with about how fun it is to own an experimentation team at a risk-averse, legal, compliance-restricted organization, I will meet you at the TLC happy hour at the end of the day. And this photo here is third grade Val, and despite how cool I look in this photo, don't be fooled, because later this year, I asked Santa for a Palm Pilot, a Franklin planner, and a label maker, so. So I'd like to start the presentation today with a story that you might be able to relate to. And to take you back to the beginning of my CRO career, when I was at the American Medical Association, to the first test that we ran that was a part of a larger initiative. This test was trying to help us recoup the 80% drop-off we had in downloads when we free-walled all the content on our corporate website, which was 20,000 documents. So I was really excited that experimentation was inserted into this process because account creation flows and everything that was new with all the redirects and handoffs made testing a nightmare, but we made it work, so we were there at center stage. So here I was, ready to present to my audience the digital strategy working team. And I was very, very pumped because one of those 3 tests that we ran in that time had a significant impact on account creation and logins. And so I was really looking forward to sharing that story. And so we're in the room, and I'm talking about those results and walking through the first test that actually didn't have a winning result. And people in the audience started to question my results. I feel like that's probably pretty familiar considering some of the content that we've been talking about for the past day and a half. And what happened was the marketers were like, I'm not sure that that's the exact approach we should have taken for launching that test. And it really started talking about difference and changes and what was an actual significant result. So I took this as a signal to educate on what a significant difference is and what those changes are. And before you knew it, I was up at the whiteboard. And if we were to go back and review the tapes to try to figure out the exact moment that I lost the room, it was probably right after I drew that first normal curve. Because here's what the meeting room looked like at that point. So we had the marketers over in the corner having their sidebar conversation, probably continuing to try to poke holes in my analysis. We had the C-suite executives who are now deeply ingrained in their BlackBerries. And then the UX designer was just chuckling to himself in the back because he said none of these were going to work anyways. And before I had a chance to regain control of the room and start to talk about the test that did have a win and talk about some of the learnings and what we were going to do next, the meeting was over. So everyone walks out. And as the COO passes me, he says, you're telling me all about how to make the watch, but I just want to know what time it is. And this was a really big light bulb moment for me because I realized I had been approaching this all wrong. I had been telling my story as a CRO and telling the linear life cycle of each of these tests and what we've learned and what was next. And my audience wasn't there for that story. They were desperately looking for new information that was going to help them make better decisions to help them dig themselves out of this hole that we created with this download drop-off. So what I want to bring to you today is this approach that I've been testing over the past 5 years to figure out exactly what content should belong in these presentations and how to craft a narrative that inspires action. So first, we're going to walk through the approach, and then I'm going to take you through the template itself. We're going to talk a little bit about how, when, and why you would flex this template, and then we're going to give you a link to download and some time for Q&A at the end. So when I'm sitting down to think about putting together a presentation, I like to start at the end and think about what I want my audience to walk away with. I like to start with what conversations do I want people having as they're leaving the room. And just to clarify, when I say audience, I mean the stakeholders who are taking action on the results and learnings that I'm sharing, as well as anyone who had a hand in getting that live. So here are some possible things that people can say as they leave the room. Wow, I can't believe I went my whole life without knowing what a p-value was. Or maybe they're going to say, well, now that I've attended that training on how to become a CRO, I wonder if I should update my LinkedIn. So I would say these are not the things that I want people saying as they're leaving my presentations. Because again, going back to my earlier story, I don't even think that the marketers were questioning my results because they didn't understand statistics or because they didn't believe what I was saying. They were just struggling with an inconvenient truth. So what are some things I do want people to walk away with? I would say that these are ideal. Wow, I'm so thankful that we tested that versus just switching over to that variation. Imagine the impact, negative impact we would have had on our business. Or even better, we should be inviting XYZ team to these meetings because they would be like in such more valuable position knowing what we're learning from all these different experiments. So with this in mind, I would argue that these are the only 5 things that we need to put into our presentations when we're presenting results. This is the template formula. Why we tested, what we tested, the outcomes, learnings, and what's next. Now, if you were at CXL Live in 2016, Leah Pica got up here on stage to talk about some presentation best practices, and I've been a loyalist of hers for a while, and one of the first things that I learned from her is that your slides are not your presentation. You are the presentation. The slides are nothing more than the visual assist to the story that you're going to tell, and so with that in mind, these are the only elements that we need to include to build out that narrative for our stakeholders. So I'm going to walk you through the template, and so we're going to go through the content of that template, and then we're going to see it in an example of a test that was never run on Search Discovery's website. Totally fake example. So first things first is you're going to want to state your business case. Here's where you're going to talk about the opportunity that we want to take advantage of. Some relevant details that you might want to include here are where you're testing this, any audience segments, and most importantly, the evidence that you're using to support this idea. So in our face test example, we have deployed a new chatbot on our Search Discovery website in order to capture leads. Management was expecting this to pay for itself in the first month, likely because they were oversold during the sales process, but we'll put that on a shelf. And some evidence that we saw is that from heat maps, people are paying attention to this real estate on the page when the chatbot pops open, but they're just not engaging with it. So it's not a blindness issue. There really might be something to take advantage of here. So before we consider this a completely poor source of qualified leads, let's test that initial question copy. So now that you've stated your base case, it's time to get into the thesis, the primary question that you're trying to answer with this experiment. So in this next slide, I like to put that into a form of a question in what I like to call the diet hypothesis statement, so it's short and snappy and concise, and then including visuals. So here's what that might look like. Will the value prop chat prompt an increase in lead capture? And so we've clearly highlighted the control and the challenger variations, and it's easy to see the differences between the two. Another reason why I like to include visuals on this slide so early in the presentation is because it roots people in something that's really familiar. So maybe you're new to experimentation, or some of these concepts are a little bit foreign to you, or you weren't a part of the test maybe to begin with, but when you see this, you're like, yep, I get it, chatbot, I see what we're doing here, I can follow the message. After this, now it's time to define how the experiment was measured and what success looks like. And again, these are conversations that happen on the front end, as we've been discussing for the past day and a half, because this is how you decided how long everything was going to run. But your audience stakeholders might not have been as involved in this test, so it's a good reminder. So here's where we're going to get into the full-blown hypothesis statement. We're going to talk about the primary KPI and then the secondaries. So I like to use the if, then, because template for a hypothesis. So in this specific fake test example, if we highlighted our value prop in the question, then we expect more leads to be captured because they're reassured that they're in the right place, we're speaking to their current problem. So it's really easy to take that success metric out of that then part of our statement, the desired outcome, and then every other metric that you're going to analyze, all the downstream metrics that we talked about with Nina, and everything that supports your analysis in determining what the outcome of that test is, here's where we talk a little bit about that. Next, I'm going to tell you to do something that a presenter earlier today told you was stupid. So Lucas, from the safety of the stage and the fact that I'm wearing a microphone and you're not, I would say that there actually is a time and a place to ask your audience which test might win. So hang on with me to the end of the next slide. Exactly, yes. This does not drive the experiment. There still is evidence and a lot that's baked into building that out. So I like to use this for 2 reasons. So here's the next slide. So this would be if you voted beforehand, if you used like Outlook voting buttons, or if you had like a whiteboard and you had people tally it, or you can do it in the room, show of hands. You could use Slido for some anonymity. But getting people to vote for this variation is a good little marketing tactic, in my opinion, because I have been doing this since the first test that I ever ran, and to date, the majority has never voted for the correct outcome. So back to your point, some of that is silly, right? But that's such a good proof point to show the value of experimentation. I never waste any opportunity for internal marketing for why we do what we do, so that if there's ever a question about resources or how we should prioritize anything, that we're considered. The other reason that I like to do this at this point in the presentation is it's a good time for people to ask questions. Because if I'm a product person or if I'm a marketer and someone's asking you, well, what do you think? You're gonna have to think to yourself, well, is there any other information I would need to know to make that call? And now you can have this little discussion before you're even showing the results. So this is a good time to take a pause from talking at people to getting them involved and talking a little bit about the experiment. But now that you've had that little interactive discussion, now it's time to talk about the results. So I like to split the results into two separate sections. One is focused on the primary KPI, and then we get into the secondary KPIs and all of your other supporting metrics. Out of all of these slides, I recommend the prescriptive way I'm talking about this one the most. So there's gonna be a single visualization that shows the impact on that primary KPI, the summary of that impact in your headline, and then at the bottom, however you translate business impact to your stakeholders, that's the so what at the bottom. So here's what that looks like. So in our fake test example, we had a winner. So you can see that that's summarized in the headline. I've used color to tie the stakeholders' eyes from that part of the chart to the headline. And then in this case, we've annualized that impact over the year. Again, you might report this in a range. You might report this with some downstream metrics that are more meaningful to your business. But basically, 1.9% and 58% lift means a lot to the people in this room. But to your marketer or to your product owner, that could be like a little intangible. So that really roots it in something that's meaningful to them, so they understand the impact of what we've done here. Now it's time to dig into the segmentation and the secondary KPIs. The major thing I want to call out here is you're only going to talk about this if it mattered, if something popped. This is not the time to take that list of success metrics and put them in a table and show it by each variation all the way down and throw it in a slide. No, because we're talking about building a story. So in our fake test example, we noticed that the desktop segment had some differences. We noticed that there was some return visitors that had some differing behavior and some different response rate, and that all paints the picture and helps us tell the story of what we're going to do next from this. Lastly, and most importantly in my opinion, we're going to focus on the learnings and the actions. And I know that this has been reiterated a couple times today, is that regardless of your test outcome, there's something to be learned here. And so it's really important to highlight that on this next slide and tie it to the actions that you're going to take. I like to do this side by side, so it's really easy to see what you've learned and what we're going to do about it. So in our fake test example, the value prop messaging resonated, so we're going to roll out to that. And also, let's find some other areas where we could potentially test this messaging to see if that's something that's going to resonate with our users. We also noticed that there was some differences between mobile. So let's partner with UX and dig into that some more. So that's another action. And we also noticed that changes in the chatbot question cause change in user behavior. So that's good to note that it's not totally blind, that there might be other opportunities we could take advantage of here. I also want to point out timing-wise, if I'm thinking about the agenda of the conversation I want to have and I'm planning out how much time I want to spend on each of these slides, this one should be 40 to 50%. I want this to be the backdrop while I'm spending the majority of my time talking with my audience about what we've learned and what we're going to do next. So take a pause after each learning and action and get some buy-in and say, do you agree? What do you think? How can you build on that idea? This is where you want the focus of your discussion. And that's it. So let's talk a little bit for a second about what didn't make it into the template. And I realize that this might be where you come for me in the Q&A. I can hear your angry keyboards on Slido now, because I didn't say to include things like statistical significance, and there was no screenshots of this variation across multiple devices. And most importantly, we didn't include that table by every single metric that we analyzed in our process. This is what an appendix is for, in my opinion. So again, if I'm thinking about building the story that's meaningful to my audience, these things aren't a part of that. But I think that the reason that we're so tempted to put some of this in there is we all know it's pretty hard to do our jobs. We wear a lot of hats. We've been talking about this for the past 2 days as well. We're the statistician, sometimes we're the copywriter, we're doing all this QA work. And I know personally, I felt like the hostage negotiator about who owns the homepage hero, if anyone can relate to that, Or how about all the air traffic control you do trying to coordinate when the new logo launches, the next direct mail campaign, new splash pages, because you need to keep track of all of that to make sure that the tests that you're running are significant and valid and are going to lead to long-term business impact. So it's really tempting to try to put this into our narrative. But if you walk away with nothing else, try to use this filter. If something isn't adding to your story in your presentation, it's taking away from it. Because it doesn't matter how hard it was to get that test out the door, or how cool your analysis was, or how amazing an insight was that you found. If you can't concisely communicate that to your audience in a way that makes them want to act, it doesn't matter. Also, there are some benefits of having a predictive template. First of all, you've set your audience expectations. They know what's going to be in that presentation. They know what's going to be covered. They know that if they have a question that isn't in one of those earlier 5 slides, that you can bookmark that conversation, jump to the appendix to show some of those screenshots, and then get back into your story. Also, this will make it a little bit easier for you to automate your process. You'll be able to whip out these presentations faster if you know what content you need to plan and how to drop them in, so you can use shortcuts and things like that. And also, this follows a classic storytelling arc. So setting the stage, the tension, climax, falling action, resolution, we can map the entire presentation we just walked through on this curve. And you know what else you can map on this curve? Disney movies, classic literature. This is a very common way that our brains are primed to hear a story. So that was all well and good. Thanks, Val, for showing us how to present the most simple of A/B tests, but I'm way more sophisticated than that. So how would you do it if it was a little bit more fancy or complicated? So I'm going to walk you through that example, but I will caveat and say that if we stick to those 5 principles of what to include, it actually might change less than you think. So in our next fake test that we never ran on Search Discovery site, we're going to continue to prioritize that chatbot, because now we have a new control to beat. But it's likely that's a local maxima, because that's one-size-fits-all messaging, and we know that our clients have a diverse set of needs. High actionability because of the low cost for an evergreen personalization campaign. So let's test this in an MVP-style way across the 3 most popular content areas. The primary question we're trying to answer is, will content-specific chats create more leads? Clearly outlined what the control looks like and the challenger, and in this case, we zoomed in to just show the copy of those challengers, because this slide's a little bit busier. So keep tricks like that in mind, especially if you're showing something that's more complicated. Use arrows, highlights, especially if it's a flow. You want to make sure that it's visually easy to understand what was tested. Then we're going to dig into our hypothesis, what we used to define success. Maybe we'll, again, vote for which variation won. And then you dig into the real. So in this fake test, we didn't see the impact that we expected. The challenger did not perform above our practical significance threshold, so we didn't roll out to that challenger. Dive into learnings and actions. The content personalization chats didn't do what we expected, so we're going to leave it as is with the current control. Perhaps content chats could be used as a cross-sell. Instead of popping the Domo chats on Domo content, maybe we should be popping Domo chats on CRO content. So that's another idea to feed back into the pipeline for the future. But first, we'll start with some research to see if that idea holds water. Also, coming to the top of those 3 content areas, maybe focusing on that was a poor choice, because maybe people who are visiting those areas didn't need to be convinced of our value in that area. So maybe we chose the wrong place. And so we're going to, again, go back and put together another test to go through our prioritization filter to figure out if there's another opportunity to take advantage of here. But the idea is that we're not done just because we did this one test and it didn't turn out the way that we had hoped. Another way or reason why you would flex this template is if you get that magical email from management, likely 4 hours before this special meeting, that they need just 2 slides to show what has been happening with testing lately. So here's what I would propose. Let's take that diet hypothesis statement slide and the one that talks about the primary KPIs and merge them into one. So the headline is talking about what we've learned. You can clearly see what was tested. We're using color, again, to draw attention to the outcome, and we're going to translate that to the business impact at the bottom. The only other thing that I've added here is that second line, which is the name of the test and the dates that we ran it, because that's going to serve as a breadcrumb between the 2 slides that you submit, because it's likely getting shoved into a larger deck, and you want to make sure that these 2 things stay together. Another thing to keep in mind is that you likely are not going to be present for every single time that this new mega deck is shared. So you want to leverage the note section as much as possible. Maybe you're going to talk about any caveats, or maybe this is where the business case goes. Any details that are really critical to understanding how to leverage the test that was ran is close to the spirit of the story that you would tell if you were there. And the second slide of the two is to talk about the learnings and the action statements, very important. And instead of doing it side by side, this time I did it linearly, thinking senior management, thinking there might be a higher propensity to print out a deck and look at it physically. So this might work better for that audience. So I've shown you an example of what a winning test looks like visualized on that primary KPI, one that was flat. So what does a losing test look like? So not that much different, to be honest, than a winning test. Again, you're going to use color, the single visual, except in the translation area at the bottom. That's where there's the biggest change. This is where you're going to talk about how many butts you saved by running this as a test. And so instead of talking about as an annualized lift, we're going to talk about what I saved you. So back to the other presentations that we were talking about earlier today. Really important to drive that home. And again, we have learnings and actions, even though this was a losing test. So it didn't make the change that we had hoped, but it doesn't mean it's not worth exploring further. So maybe we need to work on some new copy. Another thing to note here is that a change to the chatbot did cause a change in user behavior. Unfortunately, it wasn't the change we hoped or expected, but it's good to know that it's sensitive enough, and so we should be prioritizing other test ideas if this is going to produce valuable leads and business impact for us. All right, summary, TLDR. Your audience is not there to learn how to become a CRO. That's so important to remember. Make sure you're crafting the narrative and the story that they came to hear. Your goal is to inspire action amongst your audience, so focus on what matters to them. And that might be just what time it is, not how to make the watch. And remember to never waste any opportunity to evangelize testing. Everything is internal marketing, and it's going to help you in the long run, especially when you're in that horse trade of resources. And here is a link to the template. So I created this in PowerPoint with all of the defaults. So there's two masters there. One is for the stakeholder presentation, and one is for the management 2 slides. And so you'll easily be able to put your company's branding on it from the theme and the design ribbon, and you can edit from there and make it your own. So with that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you, Valerie. All right, well, let's kick start. I've been including information like stat-sig in my presentations. How do you recommend I take that away?
That's a really good question. So I would say starting with that appendix and really building that out, because if people are used to that information, you can jump to it like we talked about and come back into your presentation, but I would say try it. There's a good chance that they might not miss it because there's a good chance they didn't really understand what that meant to begin with. So as long as you're giving them the point of like, here's what we did, here's what we learned, go do this, here's my recommendation, it might not actually even be a point of contention.
Are you saying that we should do a PowerPoint for every test? What if we're running at high volume?
That's a really good point too. So when I was at the American Medical Association, we had an internal blog where we talked about, we had one post pre-test and then one that was the analysis, and that was the primary way that we shared results. But we also still had sessions that we wanted to be presenting, and that's when I would leverage this template. However, I would still use a similar framework for deciding what content is meaningful for building out that story. So maybe you do it via email, maybe you're using program management like effective experiments. Build out whatever that final deliverable is into the key points that are meaningful to your audience. So use that same filter.
All right, and drum roll, what breed is your dog?
So we thought she was Jack Russell and Beagle, but she's actually Beagle and Cocker Spaniel and Westie.
And you can post a photo of her in the app, right?
Yes,
so
I will. She's really cute.
Seems like my appendix will be longer than the actual presentation. So is that how yours looks?
Yep, it sure is. So those 5 or 6 slides up front, that's for your story. And again, make sure you're putting that learnings and action slide as the meat of the conversation. Build out your agenda so that's what you're focused on. And that appendix, it can be as big as you want. If you want to put past test results in there that showed how you laddered up to this new evidence, any other links, that's where it belongs, and it is totally fine if it's longer than your presentation, I would say.
So this is an interesting one. Is this for a presentation to convince the stakeholders of the next steps for the test, or rather to inform them of what was tested, the results, the conclusion, or both?
So I think it's both. So if you follow this template, I guarantee you that you're not going to walk away without new test ideas if you're focused on the learnings and actions. There's no way that discussion isn't going to lead to, what if we tried, or did you know that we found X, Y, Z in the data? So this is to talk about what has been done, but it is such a rich source for prioritization and new testing going into your pipeline.
Do you share quant results when there's no stat sig diff between the control and treatment? Fear that folks will use discretionally if it's there appears to be a small lift.
This is such a good question, because even in that one fake example, it's like 1.8, 1.9, and someone's like, but that one looks higher. But again, what I like to do on the front end is in that test plan, we talk about like a test outcome matrix, like credit to Brooks Bell from whenever I pulled that out in 2014. If we're talking about what we've learned and what's going to happen next on the front end, then you're also going to be discussing what's practical, what's practically significant, what's actually going to be a change that you would roll out for your business, which again is how you decide how long you're going to run the test and everything like that. So I think that if you can take your audience as far as to not show the test results for things that aren't, good for you. I struggled to take it that last edge over the line, but I feel your pain.
Okay, and our last one then is, do you have slide templates for upcoming and ongoing tests?
So that is a really good idea. So again, in previous organizations, I had blog posts to link to for some of that information, or effective experiments. But if you don't have either of those, that would be a great way to say, drum roll please, here's what's coming next, and talk about and visualize some of those opportunities. That's a great idea.
So, and it looks like the link to the template might not have been working, so maybe when you post the photo of your dog in the app, you can also post the link again.
Yes, absolutely. Apologies for that.
Thank you very much, Valerie.
Yes, thank you.